The loft still smells like her. I don't know how. 3 seasons gone, but it does. Sweet feed and neatsfoot oil, and something underneath that I can't name, that I've stopped trying to name. I'm sitting up here at the top of the ladder with my back against the hay bales, the light coming low and orange through the gable window, the way it does around 8:30 in late October, and I've got her ledger open across my knees, like I do most evenings now, whether I mean to or not. It's cloth-bound, dark green, the corners gone soft and gray from handling. The spine cracked somewhere around 1997 and never got fixed. My thumb runs down a column of tally marks in pencil, hundreds of them, grouped in 5s, page after page, and next to each group, a date and a weight in pounds. October 14th, 2015. 340 lbs. March 2nd, 2018. 290 pounds. On and on. 14 years of it, in handwriting that starts out careful and gets looser and more tired the further you go, like she was running out of patience with something, or running out of time. I used to think this book was just her keeping track of a nuisance. That's what I would have called it too, back in April, before I understood what I was looking at. 9 tons. That's what it came to, near enough, by the time I finally sat down and added the columns myself, with a calculator on my phone, sitting right here in this same spot, with the same dust, turning gold, in the same light. 9 tons of somebody else's garbage, dumped over my back fence for 14 years, by a rope mill that never asked twice, and never wrote it down anywhere but here, in her hand, in this book. I want to tell you how that garbage is the reason I still have this farm. I want to tell you about a man named Earl Kesey, who I never met, and a technique he taught my great-aunt in a year I wasn't even born yet, and how it was sitting in the back pages of this same ledger the whole time, waiting on somebody to turn the page far enough. I want to tell you about a supervisor who thought he was doing me a favor by cutting me off, and what he found himself signing 4 months later instead. But if I tell it that way, straight through, it won't sound true, and it needs to sound true, because it is. So I'm going to start where she'd have started, which is not with the ledger at all. It's with a Tuesday morning in April, a phone call from a lawyer's office in Tillamook, and a banker who looked at me like I was asking to borrow money for a science fair project, instead of trying to keep 11 boarded horses fed through the summer. That's where this really begins. My great-aunt died on the 9th of March 2024, on a Saturday, in the same bedroom she'd slept in since 1968, and the lawyer's office in Tillamook didn't call me until the following Tuesday, because it took them that long to track down which niece's daughter I even was. I was living 40 minutes away in Hillsborough at the time, working the counter at a feed store, renting half a duplex with a girl named Renata, who raised rabbits in the backyard against the lease terms. I hadn't seen my great-aunt in 11 months. That's a fact I don't dress up for anybody. She'd sent me a card at Christmas with a $20 bill folded inside it, and I'd meant to drive out and thank her in person, and I hadn't, and then she was gone. And the farm, 22 acres of pasture, and a farmhouse with a bad roof, and a barn older than the road it sat on, was mine, according to a will she'd apparently drafted 3 years earlier, and never once mentioned to me. 11 horses were boarded there when I arrived that first week. 11 horses belonging to 11 different families in Tillamook County, who were paying, on average, $210 a month, and none of whom knew yet whether the girl inheriting the place had any intention of keeping their animals fed. I did the math on a legal pad at her kitchen table the second night, under a bulb that flickered every time the refrigerator kicked on, and the math wasn't good. Board income covered feed, mostly. It didn't cover the roof over the run-in shed, or the vet bills that came due in April like clockwork, or the note still owed on a 2015 hay baler that Vivian had financed through the co-op in Tillamook and never finished paying off. That's what took me to the bank. Cascade Pacific Community Bank, the branch on 3rd Street. A loan officer named Mr. Dunleavy, who had a photograph of his own quarter horse on his desk, and still looked at me across it like I'd walked in wearing a Halloween costume. I was asking for $4,000 to patch the run-in roof before the summer rains, and he asked me, I remember this exactly, whether I had a father or an uncle who could co-sign, and I told him my father had been dead 6 years, and I didn't have an uncle, and he said he'd need to see 2 years of farm income to even bring it to committee. I didn't have 2 years. I had 11 horses, a dog named Chester, who wouldn't stop barking at the propane truck, a gelding named Buck, who'd belonged to Vivian for 18 years and grieved her in his own quiet way, and a back pasture that, every few weeks, without explanation, filled up a little more with somebody else's garbage. I didn't think much about the garbage back then. It was just weather, the way rain was weather, the way a certain kind of gray came in off the coast in November and stayed until May. Vivian had never explained it to me, not once in the 2 years I'd visited her on school breaks, and I hadn't thought to ask. Frayed rope, cut ends, rejects. It came over the back fence in loose piles every few weeks, and Vivian would go out with a pitchfork and drag it into the far corner by the old smokehouse, and that was that. I assumed it was trash. I assumed somebody was too lazy to haul it to the dump, and my aunt was too polite, or too tired, to make them stop. That was still what I assumed on a Tuesday in the middle of April 2024, when a man I'd never seen before came walking the fence line with a clipboard tucked under his arm, like it was already evidence of something. He introduced himself as the new plant supervisor over at Silet's Cordage, said his name fast enough that I had to ask him to repeat it, and told me he'd been going through legacy arrangements since the ownership change back in January. He said the word legacy, like it tasted bad. He walked the fence with his eyes on the ground, not on me, counting something, maybe the piles, maybe just the distance between posts, and he said the company's insurance carrier wouldn't stand behind an informal dumping agreement that had never once been put on paper in 14 years. There's no liability release, no signed indemnification, nothing, he said. If one of your animals gets into this line and hurts itself, that's on us. If a fire starts in that scrap pile, that's on us too. My predecessor should have shut this down years ago. I asked him who his predecessor was, and he said a name. Loyette, I think, or something close to it. And I told him I didn't know that name either, that as far as I knew, it had always just been an understanding between the mill and my aunt. He said that was exactly the problem. An understanding wasn't a contract. An understanding didn't survive an audit. He told me the last delivery would come June 1st, and after that the fence line would stay clear. And he said it the way you'd tell a child that recess was over. Not unkind exactly, just final. Already moving on to the next item on whatever list lived behind that clipboard. He didn't ask what the hemp had ever been used for. He didn't ask if it mattered to me. I don't think it occurred to him that it could. I stood there in my barn boots with Chester barking himself hoarse at his truck idling on the gravel turnout, and I said okay. Just that. Okay. Because I had a roof to patch and a bank that wouldn't lend me the money to patch it, and I didn't have room in my head yet for a pile of rope scraps I'd never once thought to open. The truck pulled out around 4 that afternoon, and I stood there another minute before I let myself feel how much that okay had cost me. Not just pride, though there was plenty of that leaking out of me onto the gravel. It was the practical math starting to run in the back of my head, the way it always did whether I wanted it to or not. Vivian had taught me that much at least, to always be counting, even when I didn't want to be. That hemp wasn't nothing to me. Twice a year I'd load the truck bed with the cleanest coils and drive them over to the Pedersons and the Whitlows and old Mr. Abernathy on Kilchis River Road, and they'd hand me $40, $60 for baling twine substitute, garden ties, whatever they needed rough cordage for. It wasn't a living, but it was real money, the kind that covered a vet call or a bag of grain when the boarding checks were running late. And more than that, it was bedding. The shredded ends made decent stall filler when straw got expensive, which it always did come January. Losing the free delivery meant losing both ends of that, the selling and the saving. in one notice nailed to a supervisor's clipboard. So the next morning, a Tuesday, I went out to the back fence line with a headlamp and a pair of leather gloves that used to be Vivian's, and I started actually looking at what I had, instead of just stepping around it the way I'd done for years. It was worse than I remembered, and better, both at once. Worse because the piles had grown taller than I was tall in places, packed down at the bottom into something almost like peat, gone gray and brittle where it had weathered longest. Better because underneath, closer to the fence, the more recent drops were still supple, still smelled faintly of the tar and machine oil from the mill floor, still had some working life left in the fiber if you twisted it between your fingers and it didn't just crumble. I spent that whole day sorting into 3 rough piles: burn, bed, and maybe. And by the time the lights started going flat and gray over the coast range, I had more in the maybe pile than I expected, more than I had any use for, more than the Pedersons and the Whitlows and Mr. Abernathy could ever buy off me twice a year. Chester lay in the wet grass, watching me, with his chin on his paws, like he thought I'd finally lost my mind. I hauled the last armload toward the barn as the rain started up soft and steady, and it was only because my arms were full and I needed both hands to open the hayloft door that I set that particular batch down on top of an old tack trunk I hadn't opened since the funeral. The trunk was oak, banded in iron gone the color of a stove that's been fired too many times, and I'd walked past it maybe 1,000 times in 19 years without once lifting the lid. That wasn't an accident. My aunt had a way of putting her whole body between you and that trunk if you got too close to it. Not sharp about it, never a raised voice, just a shifting of weight, a hip turned so you'd have to walk around her to get near it, the way she'd angle herself in front of a green colt to keep it from bolting. I remembered asking her once, maybe I was 11, what was in there, and she'd said, without looking up from whatever rope end she was splicing, nothing that concerns you yet, and gone back to work, like she hadn't said anything strange at all. Her hands were always doing that, splicing, whipping, coiling. I don't think I ever saw them still except at the very end, in the hospital bed in Tillamook, and even then her fingers moved a little against the blanket, like they were hunting for something to twist. I set the hemp down on the trunk lid and stood there a minute, letting the rain find the gaps in the barn roof and tick onto the old tin below. The smell coming off that pile was thick in the loft with the door shut. Tar, brine, machine oil gone slightly rancid with age, and under it the green smell of the fence line, where the fresher drops had been sitting in wet grass. It was a smell I associated with the whole back 40 of that property. With the sagging cedar posts and the rusted top strand of wire, the mill's dumping had bent low in 3 places over 14 years, the fence itself worn down like an old shoe, from nothing but the weight of scrap rope thrown over it, twice a month since 2010. I ran my thumb along a length of it, feeling where the fiber had gone slick and where it had gone dry, and I thought about how many times I must have watched her do exactly this, without understanding what she was doing. Testing it, grading it, like she was shopping from a pile most people would have called trash outright. Chester barked once from the bottom of the ladder, short and unbothered, the kind of bark that means nothing's wrong, just checking in. I told him to hush, and he didn't. I looked at the trunk lid a while longer than I needed to. There was a brass latch on it, tarnished near black, and no lock. She'd never locked it, which somehow made it worse, like the trunk itself had understood the rule and never needed reinforcing. I could have left it there. I had 11 horses to feed and a fence to mend and a supervisor's letter sitting on my kitchen table with a date circled on it in blue ink. Instead, I set my hand flat on the lid, feeling the cold coming up off the iron banding, and I lifted it. The smell came first, cedar shavings gone soft with age, and beneath that something mustier, leather, that had dried out and never been oiled back. On top sat 3 halters I didn't recognize, the kind with brass hardware nobody made anymore, buckles shaped different from anything in my tack room. I lifted them out one at a time, laid them across my knees, and underneath was a folded horse blanket, moth-eaten at the corners, and underneath that, wrapped in a flour sack gone gray with dust, a book, cloth-bound, dark green once, faded to the color of a stagnant pond. The corners had softened from handling, gone round instead of square, and when I opened the cover, the spine cracked in a way that told me it hadn't been opened in years, not since before she got sick, maybe longer. The first page had a date in the corner, January 1990. Her handwriting, small and slanted, the same hand that used to leave notes on the feed-room door about which mare was due to foal. I turned pages slow, because the paper had that dry brittleness that makes you afraid of tearing something you can't get back. Rows of numbers. Dates down the left margin, 2 a month, steady as a heartbeat. The 3rd and the 17th, the 3rd and the 17th, on and on. Beside each date, a weight, 41 pounds, 38, 52. Some months higher, some lower, but never skipped, not once that I could find flipping through. I sat back on my heels and did the math without meaning to. 2 entries a month, 12 months a year, 14 years. That was better than 300 deliveries, each one weighed and recorded like it mattered, like somebody down at the bank might ask to see it someday. This wasn't a woman taking what a foreman felt like handing over the fence out of pity or convenience. This was tracking. This was a ledger, the way a ledger's supposed to be kept, the way you'd log grain deliveries, or vet visits, or the exact date a mare came into heat. My throat went tight in a way I didn't expect, because I understood then that every time I'd seen her out at that back fence, gathering up hemp in her arms like she was collecting kindling, she'd already known exactly how much it weighed before it touched the ground. Chester barked again from below, more insistent this time, and I called down that I was fine, I was coming, in a voice that didn't sound entirely like mine. I kept turning pages. Somewhere past the middle of the book the numbers stopped and the handwriting changed. Smaller, more cramped, like she'd started writing for herself instead of for the record. I turned one more page and stopped, my thumb resting flat against a diagram I didn't understand yet. 4 looping lines crossing over each other in a pattern I'd never seen tied into rope in my life. The diagram took up the whole page, drawn in pencil and gone over again, in ballpoint like she'd traced it twice to make sure it would still be there years later. 4 strands, numbered 1 through 4, in small, careful script, arrows showing which crossed over which and in what order, and beside it a column of measurements: strand length, finished diameter, how much take-up you lost to the crown of the braid versus a plain twist. Underneath, in that same cramped hand, it said, E. Kesey's 4-strand crown, learned July 1988, Silet's Yard, behind the splicing shed. I turned the page and there he was, a photograph, corners gone soft and yellow, tucked into a little paper sleeve someone had glued to the binding so it wouldn't slide loose. A man in his 60s maybe, squinting against the sun in front of a low building I recognized even 40 years on. That same tin roof, that same loading dock, with a length of rope stretched taut between his 2 hands like he was showing it off for the camera. Written on the back, though I didn't turn it over yet, just held the page down flat and looked at his face a long moment, at the rope pulled tight enough it must have bitten into his palms. Below the photograph she'd written it out like a story, not a log entry. Said Earl Kesey had worked the mill going on 30 years by the time she met him. Ran the splicing shed before the old ownership sold out, and the new people brought in machines that didn't need him anymore. Said he used to braid halters and leads on his own time, off the clock, out of whatever came off the reject line, because he couldn't stand watching good fiber get baled up and hauled to the dump when there was still strength left in it. Said he taught her the crown braid one afternoon in July of 1988 because she'd asked him a question nobody else at that mill had bothered to ask in 30 years. Not what the rope was for, but what it could still be for. She'd written, near the bottom of the page, in ink that had faded to a color between brown and gray. Earl said a rope doesn't know it's scrap, only the man selling it does. I sat with that a long time, long enough that Chester gave up barking and just laid down at the bottom of the ladder, with his chin on his paws, waiting me out the way he waited out everything. Long enough that the light through the loft window shifted a full hand's width across the floorboards. I kept looking at the diagram, at the arrows, at the numbers in the margin that meant nothing to me yet, and everything to whoever had written them down. And I thought about 9 tons of hemp sitting out past the back fence that I'd been planning to haul off to the county dump inside of 6 weeks. I set the ledger down flat on the trunk lid and went looking for whatever else was under it, because that's the kind of thing you do when a page has just told you something true and you're not ready to stop touching it yet. My hand hit wood before it hit cloth. I pulled out a jig, a hand-sized frame of what I'd later learn was vine maple, 4 notched pegs set in a rough square, worn dark and smooth in the places a thumb would land 1,000 times over. On the underside, cut in with a pocket knife by somebody who wasn't trying to make it pretty, were 2 letters. EK. I didn't sleep much that week. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell this part like the jig just worked, like I fit the hemp to the pegs, and the rope came out right the first time, the way it does in the videos, where somebody's hands move too fast to actually learn from. That is not what happened. What happened is, I sat at the kitchen table past midnight on a Tuesday with 3 lengths of scrap hemp, the ledger propped open against the sugar bowl, and I ruined every one of them. The diagram showed 4 strands crossing in a pattern I could follow, with my eye but not with my hands. Over, under, over, tuck. And every time I got to the 4th pass, something slipped. The tension would go loose on one strand and tight on another, and the whole braid would list sideways like a fence post after a wet winter. I'd get 6 inches in, proud of myself, and then watch it come apart in my palms like it had never been holding together at all, just waiting for me to notice. Chester took to sleeping under the table those nights instead of by the stove, like he could tell something was costing me more than it looked like from the outside. Buck would nicker once from the barn around 11, same as always, and I'd ignore him and keep working the strands until my fingers cramped up and quit listening to me. By Thursday, I had a pile of ruined hemp on the floor by my chair, each piece maybe 2 feet long, twisted wrong and abandoned. And I remember picking one up and turning it in the light and thinking it didn't even look like rope anymore. It looked like something that had given up in the middle of becoming. I went back to the margin notes, the numbers I'd dismissed as meaningless. 3, 7, 2, 5. I started reading them as counts, not decoration, instruction. Somewhere in a mill office 2 towns over, a man had written down exactly how many times each strand needed to cross before the tension would hold, and my aunt had copied it down 36 years ago in handwriting steady enough that I finally trusted it more than my own hands. I set the jig on the kitchen table where the lamplight fell strongest, that old cone of yellow from the fixture Vivian never replaced, and I lined up 4 strands the way the diagram showed, longest to the left, the way Earl Kesey apparently always did it, according to a note in the margin that just said, L to R, never guess. My hands were shaking a little, not from cold. Chester lifted his head off the floor and watched me the way he watched storms coming, ears up, not moving. 3 crosses, then 7, then 2, then 5. I said the numbers under my breath like a phone number I was trying not to forget, and the jig clicked each time a strand locked into its new position. A small, dry sound, wood on wood, nothing dramatic about it. I kept my eyes on the angle where the fibers met, not on my hands, because Vivian's notes said the eyes went to the hands, and the hands forgot what the eyes weren't watching. Around the second sequence, I noticed I'd stopped breathing normally, just short pulls of air through my nose, and I made myself exhale on purpose before I lost the count. The rope started holding tension I hadn't felt from it before. Not stiff, alive, almost, the way a green branch holds itself before it's cut. I ran my thumb along the crown of the braid, and it didn't catch. Didn't fray at the edge like every attempt before it had. It sat in my hand with weight, distributed the way a good rope does, the way none of the mill's own retail line ever quite managed, according to what customers used to tell Vivian, back before I was old enough to hear it secondhand. I set it down, picked it up again like it might have changed in the 4 seconds it sat on the table. It hadn't. It was still right. I don't know how long I sat there before I made myself get up and put water on for coffee I didn't need, just to have something to do with my hands that wasn't touching that rope, because some part of me was afraid that if I handled it too much, I'd find the flaw, the place where it would come apart under real weight, the way everything else had come apart that week. Chester came and put his chin on my knee. I didn't look down at him. I looked at the rope on the table, 12 feet of scrap hemp nobody wanted, coiled the way Vivian used to coil the good ones, and thought, for the first time since March, that I understood something she'd known for a long time before I did. The drive to Redmond takes just under 3 hours if you don't stop, and I didn't stop, not even in Sisters, where the gas gauge sat closer to empty than I liked. I had the rope and one finished halter on the passenger seat, wrapped in a flour sack towel like they were something that could bruise. Vivian's truck doesn't have air conditioning that works past 40 miles an hour, and by the time I crossed into the high desert, the towel was damp from my own hands more than anything else. The supplier's name was stitched on a patch above his shirt pocket, Dale, though I never called him that. Called him Sir, the way you do with a man twice your age, who hasn't decided yet whether to take you seriously. His shop smelled like leather oil and diesel. He had a wall of ropes behind the counter, commercial stock in tidy rows, colors sorted, prices marked in grease pencil. He took my halter without much ceremony, turned it over twice, ran his thumb along the crown weave, the way you'd check a seam for a loose thread. He didn't say anything for a while. Pulled one of his own off the wall, a name brand one, set them side by side on the counter, and pulled both taut against a hitching post out back, while I stood there with my hands jammed in my coat pockets, trying to look like a person who did this kind of thing every day. Mine held its shape. His slid. He didn't whoop or shake my hand or say anything that would have made a better story. He just looked at it a second time, slower, and said he'd take 4 to start, see how they held up on some green colts his customers were fighting with, and if they came back clean, he'd talk numbers. I said that sounded fine. It came out steadier than I felt. 3 weeks later, he called the house phone, which still has Vivian's outgoing message on it that I haven't had the heart to change, and told me he wanted 20 a month, standing order, first of the month, net 15 days. I wrote the number down on the back of a feed receipt because it was the only paper on the counter, and then I sat with it a long while before I called him back to say yes. I didn't think about the mill then. Didn't think about the fence line, or the supervisor, or the notice taped to the gate that spring. I thought about Vivian's coffee can full of grease pencils, and how she must have known, some version of this, long before I ever opened that trunk in the loft, and how strange it was to be standing in the middle of her plan without her there to see it land. The supervisor came back on a Tuesday in August, the 20th, driving a company truck I hadn't seen before, newer, the Silet's cordage logo still glossy on the door, instead of faded like the others. I was in the barn aisle, picking a stone out of a boarder's foot, when I heard the gravel crunch, and I didn't hurry. Vivian never hurried for men who'd made her wait first, and I figured that lesson applied to me too now. He had a folder with him this time instead of a clipboard. Different posture than April, less certain of the ground he was standing on. He said corporate had sent an environmental compliance officer out to 3 of their satellite yards that summer, and the one thing that kept coming up was undocumented waste streams, hemp line included, and how insurance wouldn't touch a liability that wasn't on paper. He said it like he was explaining it to himself as much as to me. Somebody above him had asked what happened to the reject line from the Tillamook mill, and for 14 years the honest answer had been a woman's name and a handshake, and that answer didn't survive an audit anymore. He set the folder on the tailgate of his truck and opened it there, in the sun, flies working the manure pile behind us, and showed me a contract with my name typed into it. Josephine Teller, doing business as the county filing I'd done in June, sitting right there in black and white, like it had always been inevitable. Per pound rate for reject and scrap line, delivered weekly, weighed at the mill's own dock so there'd be no argument about it. He'd already signed his half. His handwriting was small and cramped, nothing like Earl Kesey's careful pencil marks in the back of Vivian's ledger, but it did the same work. It made a thing real that had only been understood before. I read it twice before I signed, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted him to see me take my time. He didn't check his watch once, which I noticed, and which I think he noticed I noticed. When I handed it back, he said, almost like it cost him something, that he supposed the arrangement had been working fine before he ever got here. I didn't answer that right away. I just folded my copy along the crease it already had and told him I'd have the first truckload of unsorted line ready by Friday. He drove out past the loft window, past the same stretch of fence where the notice had hung that spring, and I stood there a minute with the paper still warm from the truck hood, thinking that somewhere in that cab was a version of me from 5 months earlier who'd have taken his first offer without asking a single question. That's where I am now, actually. Still up in the loft, still in the same spot where I found the ledger back in April, except now it's October, and the light comes through the gable window at a lower angle, thinner, the kind of light that means the rain's coming back for the winter. The ledger's open on my knees, to the page with Earl Kesey's diagrams, the crown braid measurements gone soft at the corners, from how many times I've turned to them. Chester's asleep against the trunk. Buck's out in the paddock making noise about his hay being late, same as always. I keep thinking about the coils. 14 years of them, and I used to believe, before any of this, that Vivian just never got around to hauling them off, that she was tired, or busy, or didn't see the point. But that's not what it was. A woman doesn't sort 9 tons of scrap by hand for 14 years without knowing exactly what she's building toward. She kept the good lines separate from the ruined line. She kept Earl's jig oiled in a trunk nobody else had a reason to open. She wrote down every delivery weight like it mattered, because she knew, someday, it would need to add up to something. She never told me any of it. I don't know if that was an oversight or a kind of faith, that whoever came after her would find it when they were ready, and not before. I like to think it was the second one. I like to think she was patient, the way this whole job teaches you to be patient, which is to say, she was willing to let something finish long after she was gone. So that's the part I want to leave you with. Not the contract, not the truckloads, not the check that comes now every month from Redmond. Just this. There's probably a drawer somewhere in your life nobody's opened in 40 years. A trunk, a shed, a box of your grandfather's things nobody's gotten around to sorting. It might be nothing. Most of the time it's nothing. But every so often, somebody kept something on purpose, and it's just waiting for the person who's willing to sit with it long enough to understand why. I wasn't exceptional for finding it. I was just here, and I paid attention, and I didn't throw anything away before I understood what it was. If this is the kind of story you come back for, stay a while. Subscribe if you want more like it, and tell me in the comments what's in your own unopened drawer. I'd like to hear it.